think I'm the only speaker this afternoon who has not been a part of the faculty of The Ohio State University. I actually come from George Washington University, a college without a football team. However, I do know the importance of football. When I was a young assistant professor at the University of Alabama, it was about a year or two after Bear Bryant had retired, and the team wasn't doing that well. They even disgraced themselves by losing their homecoming game to Vanderbilt. So I made a series of what I thought were humorous observations. And one of the older faculty took me aside and he said, "Boy, this ain't funny." When the team has a bad year, they fire the coach, and then they fire the president who hired the coach, then they fire the dean, and the dean hired you. Okay, so you've all heard in Professor Murray's keynote address yesterday and in the two lectures this morning about the course and the outcome of the Pacific War. And now what I'd like to tell you is, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. We've all seen pictures of the surrender ceremony here on the battleship Missouri. On September 2nd, 1945, shortly after presiding over the formal surrender of the Japanese in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur broadcast an address to the American people. "Today, the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. The skies no longer rain death. The seas bear only commerce. Men everywhere walk upright in the sun. The entire world is quietly at peace." Well, what I'd like to suggest to you today is that though the Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, the fighting never really stopped. Within 1 year after that surrender, almost all the countries of Japan's former empire, except Japan itself, were engulfed in communal violence, banditry, civil war, or insurgency. Thousands of Japanese soldiers still in Asia were directly involved in this widespread fighting. At the end of 1946, an American journalist reported from Asia, "From one end of the vast continent to the other, it has seldom been possible since Japan's collapse to escape the sound of continuing gunfire. There has been civil war in China, nationalist war in Indochina and Indonesia, rioting and mutiny in India, political collisions in Korea and the Philippines. In places like Indonesia, Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, more people died as a result of various kinds of post-war violence than lost their lives during the Second World War." So how did this happen? Well, we can say that it's connected to the developing Cold War confrontation between the Soviets and the United States, and that is connected to the revolt against colonialism in the post-war world. Except the Cold War doesn't really get going until about the end of 1946. The Truman Doctrine isn't announced until March 1947, and much of the violence in Asia in the first year after the Japanese surrender isn't necessarily, as we'll see, connected to fighting colonialism. So it can't just be the Cold War and decolonization that we have to look at to explain the state of Asia at the end of World War II. So how can we characterize Asia in the months after the Japanese surrender? Well, we have to remember that 3 cataclysmic changes had taken place on that continent in the space of less than 4 years. The first was the defeat of the colonial powers by the Japanese in 1942. That event had profound psychological and social consequences. The old ideas of European racial, cultural, and technical superiority, carefully cultivated by the European colonialists for over a century, all ended in a few weeks. We felt that the British were not supermen as we used to think, recalled a young Singapore Chinese, and we remembered seeing them on the long marches to Changi jail. It was a pitiful sight. Even the older people realized that the white supremacy was a myth, that the Japanese had come and shown that Asians could overthrow the white authority. The second cataclysmic change was the subsequent 3.5 years of Japanese occupation. During that period, millions of former colonial subjects now found themselves participants in Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. For the great majority of Asians, Japanese rule brought hardship, insecurity, and oppression. Everywhere in Japanese-controlled Asia, there was a catastrophic drop in rice production. Large-scale requisition of rice by the Japanese military in exchange for near-worthless occupation currency discouraged rice farming and encouraged hoarding. At the same time, the breakdown of international and local transportation due to war activities, military operations, left many farmers with no means to get their crops to the market. The result was widespread malnutrition and occasional famine. You may have read about the Great Calcutta Famine during the war and the Great Famine in northern Vietnam in the last months of the war. In addition, Japanese rule in many places proved more oppressive than the old colonial system. Throughout the areas of Japan's empire, no one was free from the attentions of the Kempite, the Japanese secret police, or from arbitrary confiscations, demands for labor, and the casual brutality of Japanese soldiers and officials. For some people, however, Japanese rule brought opportunity. Thousands of lower-ranking native, as they were called, native bureaucrats, technicians, policemen, and teachers, and now found themselves promoted to jobs previously reserved for Europeans. The changed landscape of political power in Asia also inspired the emergence of new political movements, as well as the renewal of older regional, ethnic, and religious quarrels and rivalries. Nationalist leaders like Aung San of Burma and Sukarno of Indonesia were able to come out of the shadows, in some cases out of colonial jails, and these leaders saw their role as the vanguard of a distinctive national community united by a shared history of great achievements whose trajectory had been temporarily interrupted by the alien conquerors from Europe. Now, with the overthrow of the Europeans by the Japanese, they saw new opportunities for independence and national greatness. Nationalist movements in Burma and Indonesia sought to further their cause by active cooperation with the Japanese. Others, like Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh in Indochina and the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army in Malaya and the Hooks in the Philippines, actually strengthened the cohesion and the appeal of their movements by opposing the Japanese. The third cataclysmic event was the American, British, and Soviet occupations of what had been the Japanese Empire. The war against Japan had been won in the Pacific, but throughout a lot of mainland Asia, Japan's army was largely intact. At the moment of surrender, there were approximately 6.5 million Japanese soldiers and civilians in the Western Pacific and mainly on the mainland of Asia. They included about 1.2 million troops in Manchuria, 1.5 million Japanese troops in China, and about 700,000 in various parts of Southeast Asia. Allied policy was that all these troops were to be returned to Japan. During August and September of 1945, the forces of the victorious Allies began to move to occupy all portions of Japan's former empire in Asia, where they would receive formal surrenders from various commands, disarm, and repatriate the Japanese. The basic surrender document, General Order Number 1, issued by General MacArthur, provided that Japanese forces in China, Taiwan, and northern Indochina were to surrender to the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. All Japanese forces in Manchuria and in northern Korea were to surrender to the Commander-in-Chief of Soviet forces in the Far East. Japanese forces in Southeast Asia were to surrender to the Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. The Japanese government and armed forces in Japan and southern Korea and the Philippines would surrender directly to MacArthur. Except for the Soviets, who didn't waste any time moving into Manchuria, and MacArthur's forces, who occupied Japan and were already in the Philippines, most of these other Allied forces were slow in arriving. In Southeast Asia, Admiral Mountbatten's forces arrived in southern Indochina in September, only in September, and in Java, in Indonesia, only at the beginning of October. The Japanese occupation of the Chinese occupation of Vietnam also only began in mid-September. So you had a situation where the established rulers of these places, both the colonial governments and now the Japanese, had been displaced. And there was no established ruling authority to fill the void. So during this interval, nationalists, communists, ethnic communities, regional strongmen, religious leaders, all tried to move in and establish new regimes, settle old scores, and organize to resist the return of the colonialists and the rise of rival groups. So, I want to look briefly at 3 countries and examine how these delays in the return of the Allied powers and the continued presence of large numbers of armed Japanese troops contributed significantly to the continued violence, continued bloodshed over the 2 years after the Japanese surrender. First, let's look at China. Chiang Kai-shek, who had led China's resistance to Japan since 1937, was the designated Allied representative to receive the Japanese surrender. Chiang Kai-shek's government had been a close U.S. ally since 1941, and he had recently signed a treaty of friendship and alliance with the Soviet Union. So politically and diplomatically, he was in good shape, great shape, at the end of the war. Yet, Chiang Kai-shek was going to have problems reoccupying the large areas of China, including most of the large cities formerly held by the Japanese. His armies were more than 1,000 miles away from the big cities like Beijing, Hangzhou, Nanjing, and Shanghai. In order to get from where they had been holding out in southwest China to the great cities and areas of the east and north, Chiang's forces would have to be lifted there by American shipping and aircraft, and that would take time. However, in the north, Chinese communist forces were already in position and were not wasting any time. Ignoring Chiang Kai-shek's orders, communist forces moved forward to disarm the Japanese and occupy some of the largest cities and take over the railroads. So until Chiang's forces could get to east and northern China, Chiang Kai-shek would have to depend to a great extent on his erstwhile enemies, the Japanese army, and the various Chinese puppet armies that the Japanese had raised in China. On August 23rd, General Ho Ying-chin, the commander-in-chief of the Nationalist armies, ordered the Japanese generals in northern and eastern China to hold and defend all areas they occupied against the communists, pending the arrival of Chiang's forces. Despite their contempt for China's military, the Japanese generals were more than willing to comply in return for the implicit understanding that the Japanese in China and their property would be well taken care of. The tacit Japanese realignment with Chiang Kai-shek was made easier by the fact that many of Chiang's generals had attended military schools in Japan during the 1920s and 1930s, and they retained a deep respect for their former teachers. General Yasuji Okamura, himself Japanese commander-in-chief in China, whose kill-all, burn-all operations were widely believed to have caused the death of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians, was still cordially received by his former student, General Ho Ying-jin. One of General Ho Ying-jin's former aides recalled that as soon as Ho arrived in Nanking for the formal surrender ceremony, he immediately visited General Okamura, who had taught him at the military academy in Tokyo, and addressing him as sensei, that is teacher, profusely apologized for having to subject General Okamura to the indignity of surrendering. Thanks largely to the Japanese, the communists were kept out of the largest cities in North China and forcibly expelled from some of the smaller ones. The Japanese patrolled the rail lines, protected key installations, and used bayonets to suppress a communist organized strike in Shanghai. Communist newspapers reported more than 100 armed clashes with Japanese or puppet troops between late August 1945 and the end of September 1945. In the area of Kaifeng, an American U.S.S. officer reported that about 130 troops of the Japanese 12th Army had been killed in fighting with the communists between the Japanese surrender and late 1945. The OSS officer reported that though the Japanese fought well, they have nothing but contempt for the Chinese inefficiency, and their only desire is to return home. For many Japanese, that return was still far off. An American naval officer reported after meeting with Chiang Kai-shek, "The Generalissimo does not desire to disarm and repatriate additional Japanese troops from North China at this time. He is fearful that if sufficient Japanese nationalist troops are not available to prevent it, Chinese communists will move into the areas evacuated by the Japanese." As late as December 1946, an American diplomat in China estimated that there were still at least 80,000 Japanese troops operating under nationalist command in China. The Chinese communists also utilized the services of Japanese troops who they had captured or they'd been able to persuade to come over to their side, and most of the tank drivers in the Red Army in the Chinese Civil War were actually trained by Japanese tankers how to drive captured Japanese and American tanks. So that was China. Let's next look at Southeast Asia. At the Potsdam Conference, shortly before the end of the war, the Allies had agreed that Admiral Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command, which had been mainly concerned as Professor Mansour points out, with conducting the war in Burma against the Japanese and getting ready to attack Malaya, Southeast Asia Command would now be enlarged so that it would include not only Burma and Malaya, but virtually all of Southeast Asia, except for northern Vietnam and a small portion of the eastern Netherlands Indies. This area comprised over 1.5 million square miles of territory, more than 128 million people, at least 120,000 of whom were being held as prisoners or internees by the Japanese under harsh conditions, suffering from near starvation in prison camps which were rife with disease. All this area, except for Burma, had been under Japanese occupation for about 3.5 years and included almost all of the former Asian colonies of the French, Dutch, and Portuguese. At the time of the Japanese capitulation, Southeast Asia Command was in the midst of mounting a large amphibious operation, Operation Zipper, to retake Malaya from the Japanese. Many of the ships in the invasion fleet were already loading or at sea when the war unexpectedly ended. And to the long list of things that might have happened if the atomic bomb had not been used and Japan had not surrendered, we can add Operation Zipper, which would have involved tens of thousands of British, Indian, and other Commonwealth troops, and of course tens of thousands of Japanese in Malaya. We don't know how the operation would have gone, except that when the first Southeast Asia Command troops came ashore in Malaya on the beaches that they had planned to assault, although of course they were no longer defended, but it turned out that the British had completely underestimated the tides and the depth of the water at the beaches, so that you would have probably had something like another tar wall in trying to land there. But as it turned out, of course, that didn't happen. The plans and preparations were frustrated by an order from General MacArthur that other commands take no action to accept Japanese surrender or reoccupy Japanese-held territory until after the formal surrender had taken place in Tokyo Bay at the end of August. MacArthur wanted to make sure that all the far-flung Japanese commands understood unequivocally that Japan had surrendered before any Allied commanders took action that might complicate this situation. Well, Admiral Mountbatten was furious. The occupation forces for Malaya were already at sea. Mountbatten said, "I can see no reason why a signature in Tokyo should make my task any easier." Nevertheless, the combined chiefs of staff backed General MacArthur, and the result was a delay of almost 2 weeks in Operation Zipper, that is the reoccupation of Malaya. Other parts of Southeast Asia saw no troops from Southeast Asia Command until a month or more after Truman's announcement of Japan's surrender. These delays gave the emerging political factions and movements in Southeast Asia time to attempt to consolidate their position and often to square off against each other. In the case of the former Netherlands Indies, the new Republic of Indonesia had declared its independence on August 17th, and it enjoyed widespread popular support, but there were also rival factions and plenty of fence sitters. In planning for their occupation of the Netherlands Indies, the British were mainly concerned about the behavior of the large, fully armed Japanese armies still in Java and Sumatra, and about assisting the large number of Allied POWs and civilian internees who had been held in prison camps in Java under wretched conditions since 1945. Troops of Southeast Asia Command, mostly units of the Indian Army, did not arrive in Java until the beginning of October. By that time, the Republic of Indonesia was 6 weeks old and had the support of a sizable group of armed militias, some of whose members had actually received military training under the Japanese. The youthful members of these groups, some similar to conventional military units, some closer to street gangs, were armed with stolen, purchased, or donated Japanese weapons. The British government had concluded a civil affairs agreement with the Dutch. At the end of 1944, the Civil Affairs Agreement provided that a Netherlands Indies Civil Affairs Authority would assume authority for any former Dutch territory recaptured from the Japanese. When the end of the war brought scattered reports of nationalist activities in the Indies and strong opposition on the part of the Indonesians to a Dutch return, the British government and Southeast Asia Command has started to get worried. They were concerned about the possibility of getting bogged down in the midst of a struggle between the Dutch and the Indonesian nationalists. Admiral Mountbatten told a Dutch colonial official that Southeast Asia Command would on no account be drawn into local troubles on Java. Nevertheless, British concerns to safeguard and evacuate the former POWs and internees, as well as British treaty obligations to facilitate the return of the Netherlands administration, inevitably led to antagonism and sometimes outright combat between Southeast Asia Command troops and the Indonesian nationalists. The Japanese were involved in this fighting on both sides. Some Japanese went over to the nationalist side and provided training in the use of various weapons and in guerrilla warfare. Most of the Japanese troops followed the orders of Southeast Asia Command and ended up actually fighting on the British side against the Indonesian nationalists. One Japanese battalion commander did so well in the fighting that a British general wanted to put him up for a medal. I'm not making this up. In this fighting, there were major battles at places such as Surabaya, Semarang, Ambarawa, and Magelang in east and central Java. But long before these large-scale battles, most Indonesians had become convinced that the Republic was in deadly danger. Rumors spread of the imminent return not only of Dutch colonial officials of Dutch troops. Spies in the pay of the Dutch were reported to be everywhere. So this atmosphere of anxiety, suspicion, anger, and resentment formed the background to what Dutch and other non-Indonesian historians have called Bersiap, from October 45 to November 47. Many historians would argue that this is actually an instance of genocide. The Bersiap period, a period of prolonged violence, kidnapping, individual and collective murders, may have taken the lives of at least 8,000 and maybe as many as 20,000 civilians in Java between 45 and 47. In addition to the Dutch, the hostility of the Nationalists was particularly directed against the Chinese community. Chinese were attempting to remain neutral in the struggle. There was also hostility toward the Ambonese, Christian Indonesians from the area east of Sulawesi, and also great hostility against the large number of Eurasians called Indos who spoke Dutch and wore European-style clothing. By late September 1945, violence was widespread in many parts of Java. People began to disappear, most never to return. Others were attacked by roving gangs of youths and often hacked to pieces. Bodies floating in the rivers and canals became a common sight. Dutch colonials who had managed to reoccupy their former residences suddenly found themselves without water and electricity. Telephones ceased to work. Youth gangs armed with knives and long bamboo spears patrolled the shops and markets, enforcing a self-proclaimed boycott against selling to Europeans. The Dutch and Eurasians were not the only targets of violence in late 1945. Indonesians in local rural areas also took their revenge against small or isolated groups of Japanese, and also against suspected Japanese collaborators. One man was executed because his neighbors discovered that he had a Dutch flag. Ambonese and other ethnic groups who traditionally had cooperated with the Dutch colonial administration were favored targets, as were members of the Chinese community. Chinese were frequently arrested and put in confinement. Others were assaulted, robbed, or murdered. In one district, not far from Jakarta, a local resident recalled that in those days, it was hard to find a drink of fresh water, as most of the wells were stocked with the bodies of dead Chinese. The violence reached a new stage in mid-October in East Java, in the city of Surabaya, where a young people's militia actually killed, tortured, and beat up some 1,500 detainees. One survivor recalled that in one room, I saw to my left and my right piles of body parts. Among them were many wounded people. The violence in Java only began to subside after the Indonesian Republic ordered Europeans and Eurasians under its control, in areas under its control, to relocate actually to the former internment camps, that is, their old prison camps that had been set up by the Japanese. And the British also ordered the former Japanese army to guard the camps against the Indonesians. This measure did provide security for the Dutch, and the Indos, although, as you can imagine, under abominable living conditions, not much different from wartime. By mid-1946, many Dutch and Indos had been able to return to Dutch-controlled territory. But the violence in Java in this period took the lives of far more people than had died in the war or were going to die in the Indonesian War of Independence that continued on for the next 2 years. The British reception in Malaya was quite different from that in Indonesia. If there was one place where the local people were really happy to see Southeast Asia Command troops, it was Malaya. An American reporter wrote that enthusiastic and cheering crowds massed along the streets and at the pier to welcome the returning British troops. During the occupation, the large Chinese population of the Malay states in Singapore was at first singled out for especially harsh treatment by the Japanese. Several thousand Chinese were shot or drowned in mass executions in 1942. Others were arrested and tortured. The Chinese community of Singapore was forced to make a large voluntary financial contribution to the Japanese war effort. After 1943, the Japanese moderated their policies to some extent, but Japanese suspicion and hatred towards the Japanese remained little changed. Generally speaking, and all in all, and for the whole time, and for all Singapore, we were living in fear, recalled Li Tian-su, who lived through the occupation of Singapore, because in our life there was no certainty. Leaving the house to go to work, there is no certainty that we will come back. Could happen to anybody. Something happens. The Malay population was treated less harshly. The Japanese retained many Malay civil servants in their jobs and appointed some to higher positions, recruited others as police or informers or municipal workers. Yet, when asked to describe their memories of the war more than 40 years later, Malaysians who responded to the survey almost universally used the words cruel and brutal when referring to the Japanese. One source of newfound confidence among many Chinese in Malaya, and a source of concern to other Malayans in 1945, was the activities of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. The MPAJA was the military wing of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Union. Both were communist-led underground organizations formed in 1942 to carry out resistance to the Japanese. The membership of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army was drawn almost entirely from the Japanese communities in Malaya. Many recruits were former laborers, and 2/3 had been born in Malaya, while the rest were more recent immigrants from China. The total strength of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army in the 8 provinces where it operated was estimated at about 10,000 at the time of the Japanese surrender. On receiving news of the surrender, the Japanese in Malaya withdrew their forces from many locations and regrouped them into smaller areas to prepare for internment. Those Japanese who remained made little effort to maintain law and order. I think the whole place went totally out of control, recalled one Singapore resident. There were murders everywhere, and I knew some of the people who had been collaborators had been murdered, and a lot of personal vendettas went on. You done me harm, I don't like you, now is the chance. They get a knife and go for you. The police ran off, because if there was one target of revenge, the police were it. Isolated groups of Japanese soon found themselves confronting Malayan people's anti-Japanese units that had recently benefited from the delivery of British arms. From the time of the surrender until the end of August, a period of about 2 weeks, the guerrillas killed about 500 Japanese local police, close to the total number of Japanese that the MPAJA had killed during the entire war. In many regions of Malaya, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army emerged from the jungle to take control of local government. By some estimates, 70% of the towns and villages were taken over by the guerrillas. In Singapore, the guerrillas boldly took the former Japanese club as their headquarters. Usually the first targets of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army were police stations and posts. During the war, the police forces, composed mainly of Malays and Sikhs, had been used by the Japanese as an anti-guerrilla force against the Chinese insurgents. Local police and other suspected collaborators were taken into custody and the police station burned to the ground. Police and former police who were unable to hide or flee were dragged through the streets, received summary trials, and then public executions. Although most people in Malaya approved of the summary justice that was meted out to the Japanese and to known collaborators, the conduct of the Malayan People's Army soon served to exacerbate tensions between the Malay and Chinese communities in many parts of Malaya. During the war, the Chinese guerrillas' suspicion and contempt for Malayans and Indians for working and cooperating with the Japanese was matched by the Malayan fear and resentment of the MPAJA. Malayan leaders complained that the guerrillas, in addition to demanding taxes and contributions, sometimes used mosques as meeting places and hideouts, and they conscripted Malay women to work for them in the jungle. The fact that most of the targets of the communist punishments and reprisals were Malays helped to fuel this resentment. So did Chinese guerrilla behavior after the news of the surrender reached Malaya. The impression everybody had at the time, recalled one Singapore resident, was that the communists had played a major role in the Battle of Malaya, and therefore they were going to occupy it, and not the British. The rumors spread by the communists that China was going to rule over Singapore and Malaya. The seemingly inexplicable delay in the arrival of British troops, long after news had been received that the Allied forces had landed in Japan, helped to fuel this apprehension. about what was going to happen. We Malays thought the Chinese would land on the island, recalled one resident. Some of my Chinese friends expected this. In many areas, the actions of the MPAJA encouraged communal fears and jealousies, mob violence, and acts of revenge and retaliation. Malays listened to frightening stories of how, on a Friday, when Muslim men had gathered at a mosque for prayer, Chinese guerrillas surrounded the building and set it on fire. Then they raped the women in the village. In another version of the story, the Muslim population of a village were rounded up by the guerrillas and brought to the mosque, where they were forced to eat the meat of pigs. In Singapore, Chinese heard rumors that an army of Malays was marching down to kill every Chinese in Singapore. Lee Kep Lin, a Chinese Singaporean, remembered that one of my neighbors appointed himself to be a leader in the neighborhood and said, "Every Chinese in Singapore has to be on the alert. If you hear a gong being sounded, we expect every male member of every household to come out and defend the area with anything you like. Sticks, knives, anything you got, you come out." So, of course, when you put it that way, what choice have you got except to say, okay? On August 21st, only a week after the Japanese surrender, Malays clashed with Chinese guerrillas in various parts of Johor province, the province nearest to Singapore. Houses were burned and some villages completely destroyed. More than 400 people were killed and thousands of others fled their homes. Anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese rioting was reported in other parts of Singapore. In some areas of Malaya, antagonism toward the, we lost the last slide. In some areas of Malaya, antagonism toward the Chinese began to take the form of symbolize, a holy war, and one of the leaders of this holy war against the Chinese was a man named Sala, who even today in Malaysian textbooks is depicted as a patriot who defended Malaya against the communists. Being a patriotic leader was actually Sala's second career. His first career prior to the war was as a leader of criminal gangs and an inmate of various jails. But since the summer of 1945, he had been leading new style gangs in a holy war against the MPAJE and the Chinese in southern Malaya. By early 1946, Sala's red bands, as they were called, had spread to other parts of Malaya. Chinese youths were also reported to be receiving military training from former Chinese guerrillas, and British intelligence reported continued racial tension in most parts of Malaya. And there were major incidents resulting in hundreds of deaths. But finally, by this point, others besides the British feared that things were getting out of hand. Leaders of the Malay community began to appeal for tolerance and order and to redirect Malay unity into a political struggle for the control of post-war Malaya. The Malay sultans, assured by the British that they would retain many of their pre-war prerogatives, began to clamp down on disorders. Wealthy Chinese businessmen, never comfortable with the Chinese guerrillas, were also ready for an end to strife. In some districts, Malayan and Chinese leaders organized district boards under a British officer to adjudicate incidents and head off further trouble. So I won't go into what was going on in the rest of Asia at this time, but I hope I have said enough to suggest to you that references to the developing Cold War and decolonization are, in fact, insufficient to enable us to understand the nature and origin of events in Asia during the years immediately following World War II. Indeed, these events have a certain post-Cold War aspect to them, with strong elements of regional and ethnic tensions, civil war, religious extremism, communal violence, and banditry. So what I'm suggesting is that, as in the contemporary Middle East, the defeat or dissolution of older authoritarian regimes, in this case, the European empires and Japan's Greater East Asia, unleashed new political forces, ambitions, and ideologies, and encouraged the renewal of older religious and ethnic aspirations. That is why I think it is perhaps easier for us today than for scholars of the 1970s and 80s who grew up in the Cold War to understand the events of 70 years ago in South and East Asia. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.